City building and management games really aren't my thing, and the reason for that is mostly because I'm awful at forethought, planning, tactical building, positioning, that sort of thing. Basically, I'd be a terrible architect. But like Cities Skylines before it, Frostpunk is one of those charming little gems that popped out of nowhere, intrigued me with a very different kind of setup, and then politely let me know that there was in fact an easy mode, so don't worry, we've got you covered. And before you say it, I know I'm really late to the party. Frostpunk, developed and published by Polish company 11-Bit Studios, was released in April 2018 for the PC and last year for consoles. It's marketed as the first society survival game where the end goal isn't to bring in more money than you're spending or to increase your city to roughly the population of Seoul. Rather, it's to rebuild a society strong enough to withstand a global climate apocalypse and to manage laws, jobs, workers' rights, illnesses, and so on, in as ruthless or benevolent a way as you see fit. So whilst the general premise is enough to intrigue me and has been for a while, it's actually the game's aesthetic that I adore. Steampunk. Steampunk is one of the most underrated, underused aesthetics in modern media. Where cyberpunk caught on particularly in the 70s and 80s, spurred on by releases like Blade Runner and Neuromancer, steampunk is one of those genres that's just incredibly difficult to do and even harder to do right. The Thief, Dishonored and Bioshock franchises are probably the most famous gaming examples of steampunk, but as far as wider media goes, it tends to be relegated to one side in favour of whatever the more commercially viable trend of the moment is. These days, fantasy, particularly young adult romance and crime dramas, are highly profitable, and this has been the case since I would argue the Harry Potter franchise began its movie career. With imitators upon imitators pouring from the woodwork, there's now a new Hunger Games, or Maze Runner or Twilight out seemingly every damn week. Viral sensations like the 50 Shades franchise and the recent Wattpad turnip After are considerably more viable for publishers to invest in because they know they sell. And that's not to say that steampunk is completely unmarketable. Here in the UK, the publisher Galanx almost exclusively deals in fantasy, science fiction and their various subtypes, producing some genuinely great works by Chris Wooding, Stephen Baxter and Joe Abercrombie. But as far as the genre itself goes, it seems to be employed more as a visual gimmick than it is an actual setting, with entire groups dedicated purely to the honestly kind of incredible craft of creating clothing that matches the visual flair of steampunk. So when games like Frostpunk come along, I get a little confused. It definitely looks cool, its visuals are excellent, its core premise is fascinating even if it has been done before, but it's a city building sim. Can I live with that? Well, yeah, actually, as it turns out. Let's go back to that Frostpunk premise. The game is set in the late 1880s, prime Victorian era for Britain and a haven for steam-powered machinery and industrialised superpowers. An endless and devastating blizzard has claimed much of the world, and in an attempt to combat it, the British government set up enormous generators in what few areas of viable land remain. From there, the idea is that the remnants of society will begin again, rebuilding their cities around this generator. Without a functional generator, it's next to impossible to survive, as temperatures stabilise at minus 20 degrees Celsius on a good day, routinely drop to minus 50, minus 60, and as the game goes on, peak at minus 150 degrees. You take on the role of a nameless captain, essentially becoming the all-seeing god over your new civilization, and your first tasks are simple. Gather enough coal to kickstart the generator, find a way to produce food, and build a beacon. In the main campaign, titled A New Home, you will be dropped in the centre of a crater with what I believe is fixed terrain, but a randomised set of raw supplies scattered about: wood crates, coal piles, and steel wreckages. You need to use these supplies as frugally as possible to prevent them from running out before you can build more industrious equipment such as steelworks, sawmills, and coal thumpers. With your beacon set up, you can also create groups of scouts to head out into the frozen waste and uncover supplies, create outposts, and find survivors. But to begin with, your main concern is rescuing those you had to leave behind prior to the start of the game. Once you bring them back, your next task is ostensibly to just keep going. Build upon your city, build a workshop so that you can unlock new research and allow for new buildings, As well as things like better insulation for housing and workplaces, the power and range of your generator, and more efficient industries. As you go on, you're encouraged to explore the wastes in search of Winterhome, another civilization that has been giving your people hope. So here it's time to talk about the other core principles of the game. Aside from ensuring that your city is warm enough, you also have to manage people's hope and discontent, displayed as handy-dandy bars at the bottom of your screen. This area of the HUD will also show how many people are homeless, how many sick you have, amputees, frostbitten, and so on. In order to keep discontent low and thus prevent yourself from being overthrown as the city's de facto leader, you must ensure that all your citizens' needs are taken care of, whilst at the same time scouring the lands and preparing for an uncertain future. Failing to maintain basic amenities will cause discontent to rise and hope to fall, although they do change independent of one another based on your actions. So that's to say, causing your hope to rise doesn't necessarily mean that discontent will fall, and vice versa. Your game plan is to appropriately manage people's individual needs alongside the city as a whole, making decisions that will shape the city's future and ensuring that you plan out your research accordingly. For example, say you have a lot of sick people but not enough medical posts. At the same time, your current housing state means that a lot of people are getting ill from the poor insulation of their basic tents. You've got 30 homeless people, but putting them in tents is only a temporary solution. You need to decide whether you want to build more medical posts with your scarce resources and hope to minimise losses whilst you wait for more wood and steel so that you can build better housing. You can commit to the housing situation and hope the sickness doesn't spread whilst you research bunkhouses and upgrade the tents, or you can find another way. You can sign one of the game's many laws that will cause discontent to rise, but at the same time will allow you, for example, to overcrowd your existing medical posts, cramming 10 people into one place instead of the usual limit of 5. This balancing act is incredibly well done throughout the game, and the aforementioned laws are a prime example of this. After a certain point in the story, hope falls dramatically and a large sect of your city threatens to abandon you and tries to return to London. The only way to deal with this is to raise your people's hope again to dissuade them from joining the Londoners, as they're termed. To do so, you must give your people purpose, order, or faith. At the beginning of the game, the laws are largely there to help you progress in specific ways. For example, you can either enforce child labour, which will get work done faster and more efficiently, but will cause serious discontent, or you can build a child shelter, which will raise workers' hope as they no longer have to worry about their children. You then have an extra option: enforce child labour in all areas of industry, running the risk of unfortunate accidents, or allowing children to help out in your medical posts or engineering workshops, where they will raise the efficiency of both areas. If you're struggling with food supplies, you can sign in a law that will cause cookhouses to produce soup instead of full meals, creating more cooked supplies from the same amount of raw food. Although this will cause slight discontent, you're much less likely to run into issues of starvation, something that can become a serious issue later in the game. You can provide people with public houses, fighting arenas, and prostitutes if you so desire, all of which have their pros and cons. The balancing of certain things is a little off. For example, building a fighting arena and a pub is always worth it since they both have significant bonuses for hope. But the only downside is that you need to spend resources to build each function. Certain other activities, however, such as allowing public duelling, come with the caveat that some instances of this will result in injury or death. And you'd expect this to be the case for the pub and the fighting arena, but it isn't. Literally the only downside to both of these is that you just have to build them. And I suppose you could argue you might also have to waste workers on the pub, as it requires at least one person to run it with 20% efficiency. For the sake of balancing, it would have made more sense to have these laws have a small percentage of breaking out into brawls, or having people be off work with a broken leg or a broken nose, that sort of thing. It doesn't necessarily bother me. After all, I've already said that I'm terrible at this sort of micromanagement, but I can imagine it might bother veterans of the genre. Regardless, after the first roadblock of the main story, where either your scouts reach Winterhome or you dally about for too long and a survivor of the city reaches your settlement before very rudely dying on your doorstep, you're given the ability to choose a purpose for your people. Order eschews any religious affiliations in favour of a lawful, stern approach to keeping the peace. You build guard towers, propaganda centres and prisons for the ruffians combing your streets. with each decision providing its own pros and cons in terms of how it will affect hope and discontent. Similarly, choosing faith will allow you instead to build opulent temples, shrines, and eventually a force of volunteers called the Peacekeepers, who can be employed to break up riots or bring criminals to you for judgment. Although you do want to keep your hope high to stop people from leaving your city, you're constrained by both a time limit on the story progression, with the Londoners leaving after a set number of days regardless of your efforts if you can't dissuade them, and also by the fact that laws can only be introduced after a set period of time. This does change depending on what the last law was that you passed, but for the most part you'll be waiting at least 1 or 2 days before you can pass another law, and a lot can go wrong in that time. The purpose part of the game will bring in more and more snap decisions that you'll need to make, oftentimes having an effect on your city's mood. A child tells the Peacekeepers that her neighbour or a family member said something inflammatory about the church and the captain, causing them to be arrested, but the child later admits to have lied. You typically have 3 options for dealing with people like this, although depending on the nature of the crime or query, certain solutions may be locked based on whether or not you've signed particular laws. In a similar vein, many solutions will require you to pass certain laws, or particularly in the early game, build a set number of homes or heaters, feed all the hungry people, or similar, to satisfy the terms your populace has given. On the topic of heating, there's a quest that will likely pop up quite regularly in your early games where people will demand that you heat their homes, and it's listed as making the house more livable. This is especially prevalent when you're only using tents and haven't yet had the chance or resources necessary to invest in steam hubs, or a more powerful generator. This specific request can be mercilessly difficult, especially when playing on anything above normal, where temperature drops are far more frequent, and a single temperature drop that causes your house insulation or generator level to be rendered moot will cause the quest to fail. And depending on your level of hope and discontent, this can be a huge blow, if not an outright failure. I've seen a fair few people online suggest that this quest just be ignored whenever it pops up, and though it certainly isn't impossible, it can be incredibly frustrating when you already have well-insulated buildings, but a sudden temperature drop negates every effort you've made and fails the quest. Requests of this type can generally be ignored completely, but be warned that doing so will cause discontent to rise. After a certain point in the story, it's also not possible to disregard certain requests and you will be forced to make a decision. They're not all dismal though. Typically, once you acquire your first fully automated worker, an automaton, you will be given the option to allow an engineer to stop working for 24 hours and take part in a project to improve automaton efficiency. This, stacked on top of the rest of the automaton efficiency upgrades that you can research, can make them up to 95% efficient, which is especially handy for when you want to keep an industry running overnight. Since humans are very needy beings who need food, water, sleep and sensible work hours, they only operate between set hours, which only vary slightly depending on where it is that they work. Hunters, for example, work from 6 PM to around 5 AM, whereas regular industry and workshops operate an 8 to 6 shift. Automatons, on the other hand, require nothing but the occasional few minutes to refuel, after which they head right back to work. This, more than anything, is extremely important for keeping your coal supply high as the cost of your ever-improving generator starts to rise, and regular work hours can only offset the coal usage so much. Making strategic use of automatons is extremely important as you draw closer to the end game, since the last thing you want to have happen is to have your generator usage be too high for your daily resources and thus run out of coal. Although it isn't an immediate game over, too long spent without a functional generator will cause a game over as your populace slowly freezes to death. The coal industry is also the only resource that requires you to have workers manually gather the fruits of your labour. Sawmills and wall drills, which produce wood, automatically deposit resources into your supply depot, as do your steelworks. However, though you have 3 ways to make coal mines which are limited to specific spots of coal-rich land, usually 2 or 3 per map, coal kilns which burn a set amount of trees per day to produce additional coal, and coal thumpers which can be placed anywhere on the map. Coal thumpers are the ones that produce the highest volume of coal in one day, especially fully upgraded, but you must have either a group of workers dedicated to collecting the coal pile itself, or you have to build gathering posts around them and assign workers in sets of 10, At the highest efficiency rating for an advanced steam coal thumper, you'll need at least 4 gathering posts, totaling 40 workers for maximum efficiency to gather that coal. If you hit the capacity limit on a coal thumper's local storage, it won't function again until you've cleared enough space, and if you don't have enough workers on it, you will routinely be stuck in the pattern of clearing a small gap and immediately having the coal thumper refill it. Having automatons either running your coal mines or your gathering posts helps massively with this, since they can operate basically 24/7 and free up workers who could be put to better use elsewhere. The caveat is that automatons take a lot of resources to build, initially 100 wood, 100 steel and a steam core, which we'll get to in a minute. So if you want to fully automate your city, you need to be extremely careful with your resources and spend them accordingly. The aforementioned steam cores act as the game's sole precious resource and can only be acquired by sending your scouts into the waste to find more. Steam cores are valuable for more than just automatons though, as many of the higher grade industries require at least 1 before you can build them, with upper tier upgrades sometimes requiring 2. The trade-off is that these buildings are considerably more efficient. Wall drills don't need a local spread of trees like sawmills do, and so can't run out of local resources. Hothouses produce raw food through the regular working day, where your hunters only head out at night, allowing you to produce considerably more food, and so on. Sending your scouts out into the waste to acquire these steam cores isn't without its risks though, as though most can be acquired without effort, there is an abandoned area called Tesla City, where you can set up an outpost to send 1 steam core every few days as long as you survive the encounter with it. More on that in a moment. There doesn't appear to be much randomisation with the areas of exploration out in the wastes, and once you're familiar with where steam cores can be found, it's pretty easy to just game the system early on and stockpile them. Although the game does attempt to curb this by having certain areas not appear on the map until specific story beats have been completed. And back to that survival encounter that I mentioned. On rare occasions, you will be given a choice to make about certain areas, most notably Tesla City in the late game and an early game encounter with bears and survivors. Whether or not you survive your exploration of these areas seems to be based entirely on a coin flip, and whilst the downside is that it's possible for your scouts to be killed, losing any resources they had gathered beforehand and meaning that you need to set up a new team, it is also completely possible and very easy to save scum the game. If your scouts die, just reload and try again. I've tested this because of course I have, and even if you save your game whilst your scouts are literally waiting in the area, you can keep reloading for as long as it takes for them to survive the coin toss. Again though, this isn't something that happens very often, so it really depends on whether you think it's worth it to do this based on the fact that there's an achievement for completing the story without a single death. Anyway, back to that story. Regardless of what happens with the Londoners, unless you literally lose the majority of your population, your game will continue into the 3rd and final phase of the main campaign, where you will need to prepare for a horrendous storm that's set to overtake you. As the culmination of all that the game has taught you up to this point, the storm reaches temperatures of minus 150 degrees, and requires you to have carefully and meticulously planned your survival accordingly. You are tasked with rescuing groups of survivors caught out in the wastes, which you can choose to ignore to focus on your own city's survival, stockpile food, and ensure that your generator is fully upgraded. Once you have this sorted, the last thing you need to do before the credits roll is keep your hope high and, well, weather the storm. I suppose the biggest issue with Frostpunk's core campaign is that things just don't really change. Your starting resources are slightly different, but the only other major modifier is your difficulty setting. There will always be Winterhome, always Londoners, always be a terrible storm. The only thing that changes is how you deal with it. But since survival is so dependent on a high-level generator, sufficient insulation, and stockpile food, the way that you win the game will likely always boil down to the same few steps. Fully research the generator, get automatons, get hothouses, get fully insulated houses, upgrade your industry. There really isn't any other way to do it, especially since poor resource management will screw you over in the late game, even if it doesn't seem so bad early on. I've lost several runs because of poor decisions made in the early game. However, I'm happy to concede that this might largely be because I tend to play on easy, and this is the case with all of these kinds of games that I play, because as I said before, I'm really terrible at management and city building games, or just tactical games in general. I've played the StarCraft franchise, but I've never played on anything above easy because I'm just not very good at the games, and to be perfectly honest, if I wanted to play something punishingly difficult for fun, I'd play a roguelike. That's not to say I haven't tried to play the game on harder difficulties. In fact, the option to play on easy mode requires you to actually start the game in normal or medium as is listed in-game, to unlock the option to select a scenario, and it's only here that you can change the difficulty. It can't be changed in-game, so choose wisely. Normal is a pretty good starting point though, and whilst I played on easy to complete the game the first time, I have since completed it on normal too, which for me is a big deal. Kind of. Even so, it is completely possible to lose or screw up a run on easy just by virtue of making bad decisions. I gave up on one easy run of the game, at the point where the Londoners leave, because my poor management previously made it difficult to manage my resources enough to keep everyone warm, fed and housed. And because of that, and in combination with bad choices made in the purpose laws, I failed to keep hope high and wound up starting over as the number of Londoners hugely increased. The last part of the game, weather in the blizzard, sees temperatures plummet tremendously and you're no longer able to send out scouts or receive deliveries from any outposts you had previously set up. In fact, if you don't recall your scouts and outpost teams before the storm starts, they'll freeze to death. So you're now left to manage with the resources you have to hand, and any that you're able to gather from your industries before your city starts refusing to work. The first time this happens, you can force them to carry on and cause discontent to rise, but eventually they will stop, so you'll need to rely on stockpiles and automatons. The other big thing that you'll need to make use of during the last few days of the campaign is the overdrive capacity on your generator. Although not hugely necessary early on depending on your difficulty, the overdrive ability ups the heat levels of anything in range by 1 or 2 depending on your upgrade level. It doesn't increase coal consumption, but it does cause a stress meter to start rising on the generator, and if it maxes out, the generator will break, and that is a game over. I've found that as long as you hold off using this until the last 2 or 3 days of the storm, you can usually get through it just fine. But if you haven't properly insulated your houses, or you don't have enough automatons keeping people alive, much less keeping them warm, is extremely difficult. There's a huge emphasis on medical maintenance because when that cold hits, it hits hard. A lot of people will get frostbite very quickly, and there are also large groups of survivors who move into your city beforehand with severely ill members. You can turn them away and focus on your own survival, but why would you do that, you heartless monster? Once you survive the extreme weather, the main campaign is over, but there are still things to do, some of which have been added in over time and hugely improve the game's replayability. There are 3 additional campaigns outside of the DLC, which adds 2 more maps with a 3rd on the way, and an endless mode that was patched in, purely for the city survivalist in you. On the PC, endless mode has 3 difficulties, depending on how merciless you want the game to be, and honestly I've been enjoying my lovely little run through of serene endless mode. The storms are shorter and less intense, supplies are more readily available, but if you're after the experience of extreme difficulty without a campaign end, you can play endless mode in endurance. And there are several maps to choose from, each with their own pros and cons. There's also the additional possibility of a random hazards modifier, which does exactly what it says on the tin. As far as the additional campaigns go, whilst much shorter and pretty much more of the same, the Arcs campaign is easily the best of the 3. Although it begins fairly simply with the task of ensuring that 4 buildings storing seedlings are kept at a certain temperature and prepped to weather the storm, you are later asked to help a city called New Manchester. You can refuse to help and focus on your own survival, but if you do choose to help, the amount of resources you need to gather and send to them is staggering. Pulling it all together at the last minute was extremely rewarding, and I don't know about you, but even in video games I can be prone to the warm fuzzies when helping people. At the time of writing, I haven't played the recently released Last Autumn DLC or the Rifts, as I don't own them, but I can certainly vouch for the enjoyability and polish of the main game. I wish I'd played Frostpunk back when it came out in 2018, because despite its few shortcomings, it would have easily been one of my favourite games of the year. Critiquing Frostpunk from the point of view of a city builder or resource management game is basically impossible for me, because I'm just not all that familiar with them and any common shortcomings they may have. I can only talk about what I know, and whilst I'm definitely knee-deep in several runs of City Skylines without cheats, I swear to God, that in no way qualifies me to discuss Frostpunk's qualities within this genre. So instead I'll just say this. As part of a struggling genre aesthetic in the form of steampunk, And from the point of view of someone who sucks at these sorts of games, Frostpunk is an excellent slice of life that, through its deceptively simple mechanics, gorgeous visuals, and strong choice-based gameplay, this is an excellent experience if you enjoy witnessing survival through suffering, dignity through despair, and hope in the face of unimaginable horrors. There's no dogs though. 0 out of 10.